Nursing workforce engagement is our topic in this BRG Nurse Executive podcast episode. My guest is Dr. Jeff Doucette, Chief Nursing Officer at Press Ganey, a fellow in the American College of Healthcare Executives, and also a fellow in the American Academy of Nursing. So let's get started.
Welcome to the BRG Nurse Executive Podcast. BRG is a global consulting firm that helps organizations in disputes and investigations, corporate finance, and performance improvement and advisory. BRG's healthcare performance improvement practice offers multidisciplinary services to healthcare organizations. We focus on implementation with innovative, independent, and data-driven solutions. In the BRG Nurse Executive Podcast, we discuss improving patient care by advancing nursing leadership. For more information about BRG, please visit thinkbrg.com. Now here's your host, Nick Shimolewski.
Jeff, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
We had Eric Martin, the president of AONL, on a couple of months ago, and his biggest issue was workforce. Tell me a little bit more about your initiatives and what your area of focus is in workforce engagement.
Sure. So we are the largest provider of workforce engagement surveys in the country in the healthcare sector. We collect somewhere between 1.3 and 1.5 million healthcare engagement surveys every single year from organizations across the country. And in addition to what we do in our workforce platform, we also have two engagement tools that are within the national database of nursing quality indicators, NDNQI. So each year we take all of that data and aggregate it to look at the national workforce picture of what's happening across all job classes in healthcare, from senior management to all frontline clinicians and staff by job category. So it's fascinating information to look at, and we help organizations really have a continuous listening strategy for their employees, either through an annual engagement survey or pulsing or some combination of both.
Now, I know that Press Ganey also does some work around patient satisfaction, and I'm going to make a parallel here because in a lot of the clients I work with, most care about either overall rating or likelihood of recommending as one of their key drivers, if you will. For the nursing workforce engagement, is there like a key overall question that kind of sums up that you're looking for that you want to hit on?
Yeah, so we ask the same question. We ask employees how likely they are to recommend their employer as a place to work. Our business started over 35 years ago. We invented basically the patient satisfaction industry as it exists today. Doctors Press and Ganey, who started the company and put together the first patient satisfaction survey. And so over the years, obviously, that has evolved in several decades to the organization that we are today. And one of the cool things about the amount of data that we have collected over that 35 plus year history is that we're able to take the various databases of employee engagement and then compare that and analyze it with patient engagement data from all different sectors that we measure. So whether it's ambulatory, emergency, inpatient, whatever the case may be. And so we now fully understand, particularly in this, what we're calling an ongoing pandemic response period, because the pandemic per se is not over. And so we're thinking about this in kind of a recovery type of mode, is that we now fully understand that in order for organizations to deliver on their patient experience promises, that can only be done on the foundation of a resilient and highly engaged care team. And one of the things that I think the organizations that are outperforming their peers now fully understood that and understand was the biggest learning, I think, of the pandemic, right? That if we put the safety of our employees first, I think very early pandemic days, right? It was all about keeping people safe with information. And then as that progressed, turned into psychological safety, well-being, building resilience. And so all that investment in people is what's helping organizations now pull away in their patient experience performance. And they're so interrelated that they really cannot be separated.
Is there a difference between expectations at a managerial level versus at a staff level? and common themes that they're reporting in the surveys?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So, senior managers and managers are almost always our two most highly engaged groups, while frontline clinicians, nurses, and physicians, and then those who support frontline care are almost always at the bottom of our list of engagement. So, just as an example, in the pre pandemic period, the national average engagement score was 4.10 across all healthcare employees. Senior managers were close to five, and nurses were close to 4. So there was a huge spread in terms of the statistical significance of the average where clinicians, all frontline clinicians, nurses, physicians really struggle. But at the end of the day, the 3-year retention drivers that we measure, so we measure about 27 drivers of retention. And as the years progress out, we know that the best predictor of 3-year retention is high performance in 5 key areas that cost organizations no money. And that is that employees like the work that they're doing. They feel safe in the environment, both psychological safety and physical safety, that they feel like they work for an organization that conducts their business in an ethical manner, that they have a leader who is engaged in the work that they're doing, and that the organization values diversity, equity, and inclusion. So those are the top 5 long-term drivers across all healthcare roles. What is so interesting is the number one thing that I hear from organizations is that they cannot deliver on their promises because of staffing and pay, or that their turnover is related to staffing and pay. But again, of the 27 or 28 measures that we measure, staffing and pay are always at the bottom of that list, and they are not at all highly correlated to overall long-term engagement. So it's really easy for an employee to say that I'm leaving because I'm getting paid more down the road, but that is almost generally never the reason that they're actually leaving. The focus on creating a positive practice environment and the work of leadership is really where we're seeing organizations pull away from the pack. So those organizations that are really doubling and tripling down on work culture, rebuilding their cultures in this ongoing pandemic period, really retooling processes and things like that, those are the organizations that are really starting to pull away from the pack in terms of performance.
Yeah, what I'm hearing, the need or the desire from staff for genuine, authentic leadership.
It really is about authentic leadership. And I think the interesting piece that's really changed over the last couple of years is that this focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion has really moved to a very highly correlated to overall engagement and really high driver of employee engagement. And that hasn't been the case up until about 2 or 3 years ago. So all of the other things like that, we like the job that we do and we like the work, a lot of those are intrinsic drivers of what we call activation, or why we do what we do, why we're in healthcare. And there are cultural aspects or work environment aspects of that activation component as well. So again, it's around liking the work and that the work is meaningful and those types of things, that I trust the organization. So that's one of the big feeders of our resilience measure. And the other side is decompression, or how people are able to disconnect from the work and step away. So those two things actually drive this resilience piece that we measure for every organization that we work with. And and it's a combination of this resilience by driving up activation and driving up decompression in this focus on work culture that is really the sweet spot for this authentic leadership approach.
Yeah, so at a staff level, there's two things that are coming to my mind: shared governance, and then AONL's old term that they were using, transforming care at the bedside, which also is really a play on shared governance. Are you seeing that hospitals that have shared governance in place are associated with hires? Is there any correlation there that exists?
So we don't measure shared governance per se, but what we do is we work with 100% of the magnet organizations in one way, shape, or form. And so we have a data set that is all magnet hospitals and non-magnet hospitals, and we look at those very regularly. And what we're seeing now is that um, for the last 3 years, all organizations have been declining in performance. However, in the last 6 months, we have seen magnet organizations make a dramatic turn in a positive direction in almost every aspect that's measured by the magnet organization. So there are 7 categories that get measured in a magnet application, like professional involvement, professional development, shared governance, shared decision making, those types of things. Um, and so what we're seeing is that organizational resilience of magnet organizations seems to be much stronger than their non-magnet counterparts. So non-magnet hospitals are continuing to decline, while there's been a sharp improvement in the last 6 months in magnet organizations. And you can't be a magnet organization without a strong shared governance foundation. Having led a large academic magnet medical center through the first 18 months of the pandemic, I'll tell you that one of the first things that we stopped doing was all the shared governance activities, right? Because we couldn't gather, we couldn't be in the same place. We were in crisis response mode. But as quickly as we figured out how we could safely get people together using technology, we immediately restarted those shared governance activities so that they could participate. All frontline staff had an opportunity to participate in how we were going to continue to respond to the pandemic. So the data clearly show that when there's a continuous listening strategy, that frontline employees are involved in decision making, whether it's through shared governance or some other form, that those are the organizations that are really pulling themselves up by the bootstraps.
Are you seeing significant swings in scores around nursing engagement with leadership turnover at the clients that you have?
So leadership is certainly a key factor, and leadership turnover can be positive or negative, right? It's
Right.
almost never neutral, right? So you could have a leader that does not do well with the team who leaves and then engagement goes up, or you have a great leader that leaves and it sometimes can negatively impact engagement. What we see is when there's a really strong leader and a highly engaged team, that the team continues regardless of what happens with that leadership position. And it's always the circumstances of the leadership change. If it's something bad happened and there's trust eroded or some huge safety event, those can negatively impact the overall engagement scores. And we certainly have seen a lot more turnover of nurse leaders in the last couple of years than normal, but those numbers are starting to come down again as well. So there's always a correlation to leadership and leadership engagement and overall employee engagement, but that can be a real fine line depending on the situation.
So we know that traveler expenses across the country have gone through the roof. Clearly, it sounds like if they're not leaving for money, then working on nursing engagement is your easiest, to your point, cost free way to retain these employees. I'm wondering, when you're doing these surveys, are they just for employees of the hospital or do they include the traveler base that you may have that's there?
So I'm so glad that you brought this up. So it depends on the client. So some clients include their staff and some clients don't. So if the client includes them, we categorize them. Some do and many don't. It just really depends on the organization. However, we are going to be publishing this week some really interesting data that we have on the impact of traveler agency temporary nursing labor on overall nursing engagement. So I visited over 150 clients last year, and almost every single site I visited, I hear from whether it's staff or leaders that pay staffing is a problem. Our use of agency or temporary or travel nurses is really impacting nurse engagement. Now, at the very beginning of the pandemic, that was probably the case, although our data are inconclusive. So there's no statistically significant difference that we saw in nurse engagement based on agency utilization at the beginning of the pandemic when rates were like twice what they are right now. But what our data show for the last year is that actually organizations that used temporary nursing labor, either travelers or agency, actually had better nursing engagement scores than organizations that did not. And the reason for that is I mentioned earlier a little bit about activation and decompression, which are the two measurable components of resilience. And when organizations invest in temporary labor, we are seeing that the decompression scores of their permanent staff are significantly higher. So that their staff who have been working crazy hours, have not had a lot of time off, or have been working short are now having reasonable assignments. They're getting to take vacation, things like that. Now, what we say in our data analysis is the use of temporary labor is not sustainable as a long term strategy. It's just too expensive. But there appears to be no difference in quality outcomes. It really is about the hours of care. More hours of care you have to a point, the better the quality outcomes are and the better nurse engagement is. So what happens is though organizations get so dependent on temporary labor that they don't do a good job of rebuilding or building their permanent core staff. So it's that sweet spot of we have a need, we use the temporary labor while we're getting the permanent solution in place, and that seems to, well, we know it doesn't seem to, we know that it drives better outcomes and better nursing engagement. So it's really interesting concept. The other thing I'll say about this though is that organizations that treat people well when they leave, who are good employees that they would welcome back and have strategies in place to bridge a gap are doing very well with what we're calling boomerang employees who have left to travel or go see if the grass is greener on the other side. And then they get there and realize that it isn't, and they want to come back. So organizations that treat those employees well and generally have some kind of incentive when they return, like for example, if you leave and come back within 6 months or a year, you get your same data service that you had before, you don't lose any seniority, those types of things. We're seeing organizations that have those things in place receive a large amount of their employees back. And that's what you want. A great employee who knows your system, knows your processes, has a shorter time to get up to speed is exactly what organizations should be doing. The organizations that did not treat people well when they chose to leave are not getting those people back.
Interesting. You talked about decompression earlier, more so, I think, from the view of the staff nurse.
Mhm.
That looks very different for a leader or a salaried employee. Are there any pearls of wisdom for having resilience? And I wouldn't necessarily use the word balance, but harmony, work life harmony
Yeah.
for the managers and the senior managers in organizations?
So I actually call it work life effectiveness because I think talking about work life balance adds to the stress of the myth. There is no such thing as work life balance. So work life harmony, effectiveness, whatever you want to call it, is defined by us individually, right? We get to decide what that looks like. The way that we measure decompression is through a series of 4 questions, and we measure it the same across all job categories. And those 4 questions then provide an average score of what we call the overall decompression domain. So the questions that we ask are, I can disconnect from work communications when I'm not at work, so like email, phone calls, etc. I rarely lose sleep over work issues. I am able to enjoy my time away from work without focusing on work issues. And now that I've told you there's 4, I'll never remember what the 4th one is off the top of my head, although I talk about it every single day. But there are a series of 4 questions that we measure that all have to do with how I get away from work. And so for managers and senior managers, this is critically important as well. So I think the days of 24/7 accountability in a hospital are numbered. I've been talking about this for years that the role of a nurse manager, for example, is the most impossible role in a hospital. And organizations that are getting leaders to be attracted to and stay in those roles are changing the way the work is done. So we're working with many organizations that are having leaders move to a 4-day work week and are having a full decompression day during the week. And what I tell those of us who are clinicians, so, physicians and nurses, whoever work shift work, right? Those 3 12-hour shifts you work, that day during the week where you could go to the doctor or the dentist or the dry cleaner or do groceries or whatever. Imagine as a leader that you got a couple hours during the week that you didn't have to be connected to work. And it has to be full disconnection. It's not that you're going home and working from home or on a Zoom call or answering emails or have your phone tethered to your hip. So the best practices that we're seeing are that organizations, leaders are really the forgotten layer of the pandemic, right? We really focused on frontline providers. Leaders took the brunt of it, and now leaders are really suffering. And again, there's not a silver bullet or a one size fits all, but we are seeing organizations really start to focus on what do we do to help the leaders heal, and how do we get to a point where they are not feeling like they are tethered to this organization 24/7.
Where do you see nursing engagement and or the patient experience evolving?
None of us know what's going to happen in 12 months, I don't think, let alone the next 5 to 10 years. I think there was a time when people in organizations expected a 3 to 5 year strategic plan. And those just don't hold water right now because there are so many unknowns with what is still continuing to happen with the evolution of COVID and the workforce environment in general, not just in healthcare, but just the workforce challenges with low unemployment rates and all of those things. So, what I will say is this, that I think consumers will continue to amp up their anger with the system and processes that don't work for them, that consumer expectations will continue to not accept what has been the routine healthcare experience for decades, mired down in bad processes, mired down in red tape. Those things are going to continue. I think that the tolerance from consumers is going to continue to really go down. The other thing is that I think the workforce is going to change dramatically. And I think it's yet to be seen what that looks like. But this ratio based thinking of how we provide care is just not going to be sustainable. There just are not enough people. The numbers don't work. So there has to be innovations and new models of care. There won't be just one, it'll be every organization innovating on models of care that make sense for what their region looks like, what their organization looks like, what the type of patients that they're caring for. So I do think we'll continue to see this transition from this kind of hospital to home model or hospital at home model. I think technology will obviously continue to evolve. We're seeing deployment of human like robots in many other organizations that we work now that are taking non nursing tasks off of nurses. So there's a lot of different things that I think are going to come into play, but I think anybody who predicts something for 5 to 10 years from now is really just doing a shot in the dark.
Fair point. One of the things you mentioned earlier around nursing satisfaction, nursing workforce engagement was the concept of psychological and physical safety. And you just mentioned and hit on consumers not accepting the status quo anymore. How do we balance and bridge that gap? Because there are more nurses and
Mhm.
healthcare workers getting beat up right now as consumers demand for the care that they should have been receiving all along. Where's the right balance to strike with that as a leader, as a nurse executive right now?
Within NDNQI, we track assaults against nurses, and our data show that two nurses are assaulted in this country every single hour. And we can tell you where it's happening, how it's happening, who's doing it. And at the end of the day, having a zero tolerance policy, a true zero tolerance policy, is what nurse executives and other executive team members need to be focused on. What that looks like are expectations for employees, expectations for patients and visitors, clear communication of what those expectations are, holding people accountable, then developing systems to prevent, mitigate, and reduce the risk when an event occurs. So, a perfect example of this, a visitor who blows up at a staff person is escorted out of the hospital, but then is allowed to come visit the next day because there's no flagging or warning system in either the visitor management system or the medical record, or they have a violent episode in the hospital and then are discharged to a clinic the next week. But nobody in the clinic knows that the person had a violent episode in the hospital. So there has to be really this amongst us of how we flag when an event occurs and that we support the staff, right? So best practice is that somebody from leadership is immediately connecting with an employee that's been assaulted. The organization provides resources to help press charges, helps the person go to court, those types of things. Now, we know that a very large percentage of healthcare workers will not choose to do that, but just being offered that support speaks volumes for organizations and having a true zero tolerance policy. So, we're not going to be able to change what shows up at the door or how people show up in highly stressful situations, but we can choose how we mitigate the risk and how we deal with the issue when it does happen. And that's, I think, where the key differentiator is going to be.
Excellent. Thank you. Any closing thoughts as we wrap up this episode?
There are two things I think that every healthcare employee wants from their employer and their leader right now. That is hope and a plan. I'm telling organizations if you're spending time on a 3-year strategy right now, you're wasting your time. You need to be frequently communicating with your teams about what is happening today, tomorrow, the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months related to their staffing support, resources, getting non-essential tasks off their plate, and that there's light at the end of the tunnel. So I worked in Catholic healthcare for a long time. We always said that hope wasn't a strategy, but now hope is a strategy because coming out of the pandemic initial response, employees want to know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel and that leaders are working on issues. Employees understand and are very forgiving that these are complicated issues that are going to take a long time to solve. What they are not tolerant of is not getting any information about what's going on behind the scenes. So that constant listening strategy and communication is absolutely key to driving hope and a plan for the next 12 to 18 months.
When you're talking about listening and communicating with frontline staff, staff receive information in different ways. What's the best way to do that?
Yes.
Grounding, being present, sending out emails, recording YouTube videos. There's a bunch of different ways to do that. And you could literally spend all your time just communicating to staff. So, how do you balance that as a leader with actually also getting work done to improve the work environment?
So the answer is yes. All of those things are necessary. How you get the resources and support to do that is a whole nother story. So I was actually talking to a CNO earlier today. We were talking about a communication strategy around some challenges that they're having. And her response to me, we put a newsletter out every month. I'm like, that's not good enough. And you can't email people every day. Most clinicians will tell you they don't check their email. So you have to meet people where they are in terms of communication. We all know that there are 5 generations that work right now. All of those generations receive information in a very different way. So at the height of the pandemic in my organization, we were using TikTok, YouTube, email. We were communicating with people in any way that we could think possible. We were able to hit a lot more people because we had a strategy that was multi-channel. So you can't get stuck on the way that, as a leader, the biggest mistake that I could make is only communicating with people the way I want to be communicated with, because that assumes that everybody wants to be communicated with the same way. So I do think a multi-channel strategy is absolutely necessary. Most organizations have communications and PR type specialists that can help with the strategy around this, create templated things that can be sent out or even templated videos. I just think the more that people can hear directly from their senior leaders, in whether that's by video or Zoom or YouTube or a podcast or whatever it is, it has to be multi-channel in order to be effective. We have tons of data that show that.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. I appreciate you taking the time today to discuss all things nursing workforce engagement.
Of course, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the BRG Nurse Executive Podcast, which focuses on improving patient care by advancing nursing leadership. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and podcast guest and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, position, or policy of the guest employer, Berkeley Research Group, or their other respective employees and affiliates.